The purpose of this lecture is to review and give a general overview of Sartre's 1945 public speech, Existentialism is a Humanism. We're reading this speech for class because it gives a really good, clear explanation of some of the basic ideas and principles that existential thinkers share, which is good because you'll notice as we go throughout the semester that there are some differences in how different thinkers approach existentialism. This is a public lecture that Sartre gave in 1945, and the purpose of it was to put forward a manifesto for existentialism that could be understood by the general public, as opposed to some of his more difficult writings like Being and Nothingness, which is really difficult. And he also wanted to defend existentialism from its accusers, from the Marxists and the Christians, who saw it as a very selfish philosophy that was promoting individualism and preventing people from being humanists, from wanting to help humankind. So that's why the full title of the speech is Existentialism is a Humanism. He's trying to show that there is an ethical, humanistic impulse to existentialism. The first principle of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. That is a fancy way of saying that you first come into existence, you first come into being and exist, and then you get to define yourself. You're not predetermined. You are nothing but what you make of yourself. So this is different from many different ways of thinking where one might emphasize all the external factors that determine who you are. So someone could focus on your socioeconomic background to say that that defines you. Someone might talk about your family heritage, your genetic heritage, your physical being, your biological being, and use that to describe who you are. But for Sartre and for other existentialists, those are not the most essential parts of who you are. Who you are is the decisions you make. It's the choices you make that define who you are. And so it's really up to you to make yourself. And this is what all existentialists believe. Because of this, they emphasize subjectivity, or the first-person perspective. Now, when we talk about subjectivity, we sometimes use it in a derogatory way, right? Someone might say, oh, that's just your subjective opinion. And when they say that's just your subjective opinion, what they mean is that's a really limited perspective. You're only seeing things from your own eyes, and therefore you don't really know the truth of the matter. And so subjectivity is often used in a way that is opposed to truth or opposed to objectivity. And that's not how existentialists think of subjectivity. For existentialists, subjectivity is the starting point. It means that all you know, all you experience in life really is seen from your perspective. And that might be limited in some ways, but it might also not be limited. And in fact, it gives you a great deal of responsibility and freedom. So it's not about isolated individualism. It's not saying that you're selfish because you're subjective. Instead, it makes you as an individual responsible for yourself and responsible to others. Because you're responsible for creating who you are, because you're responsible for making yourself, Sartre believes that that makes you more responsible for humanity. Because when you act not just based on a particular idea that's been given to you. You're not acting on instinct. You're acting in a way where you're creating an image of what you believe humanity should look like. And so that makes you more responsible for all your moral choices and all your moral actions than someone who thinks that morality is just handed down to us from God, or that morality is already determined in advance. So for Sartre, morality is something that has to be decided in the moment. It's something that has to be created like a work of art, where you can't plan it in advance. You have to pay attention to what's going on in the particular circumstances, and you have to create it. You are responsible for creating that moral action. On page 346, Sartre says, "If existence really does precede essence, man is responsible for what he is. Thus, as existentialism's first move is to make every man aware of what he is, and to make the full responsibility of his existence rest on him. And when we say that a man is responsible for himself, we do not only mean that he is responsible for his own individuality, but he is responsible for all men." So in this way, the emphasis on subjectivity is an emphasis on the individual, but not just private subjectivity, not just being concerned with your own narcissistic, egotistical concerns. It is a type of subjectivity that recognizes your responsibility to other people. It is for this reason that Sartre calls existentialism an ethics of action and involvement. Subjectivity necessarily includes other people. This is why he emphasizes inter-subjectivity, which we will discuss much more the second half of the semester. Inter-subjectivity is how my subjectivity interacts with the subjectivity of other people. Once I recognize my subjectivity, that I have unique experiences as an individual, that I have freedom to create myself, this is something then I recognize that other people have. I can't assume that only I have it, that wouldn't make sense, but others also have the freedom to create themselves. They also have their own unique perspectives, their own individual lives. And so my subjectivity is always in relation to the uniqueness of other individuals. So existentialism is about not only honoring my individuality, but also honoring the individuality of other people. This all sounds great, but existentialism is really difficult. And in fact, this is why Sartre thinks that people have such a poor opinion of existentialism, is that in practice, this is actually very difficult to do. It's difficult to take responsibility for who you are. It's difficult to create who you are. It's difficult to recognize that you're radically free and that you are responsible for your life, and you can't blame who you are based on circumstances or outside factors. This is where anguish, forlorness, and despair come in. These are the content of existentialism, and they are the direct result of the idea that existence precedes essence, or that you make yourself, or as Sartre also calls it, subjectivity as the starting point. For Sartre, anguish is the feeling of total and deep responsibility, that your responsibility is inescapable. Anytime you act, you have to take responsibility for that action. And this is difficult because there are often consequences to your actions and consequences that affect other people. And so action is something that has a lot of pressure on it. And he uses the example of the military officer to describe what anguish is and why anguish is a part of every action. So the military officer has to make a decision of what to do. Even if he's following orders, he has to interpret the orders. And then once he makes a decision, once he makes some sort of military action, it involves the lives of other people. Right? It affects other people. And if something goes wrong, if lives are lost, he cannot blame that on anyone but himself. So he must take responsibility for his action. Forlorness is related to anguish. He calls forlorness the idea that we are abandoned and have nothing to cling to. He says, God does not exist, and that we have to face all the consequences of this. Sartre also says that man is forlorn because neither within him nor without does he find anything to cling to. He can't start making excuses for himself. He is condemned to be free. Sartre uses his student as an example here. So this student is trying to make a decision between staying at home with his mother, who has lost a lot and is suffering and needs him, or to go off and fight with the Free French forces to help his country, to avenge his brother's death, and fight in a just war. Now, religion would say, do the charitable thing. But what is the charitable thing in this case? Is it to care for his ailing mother, or is it to fight in a just war? So even if you have a principle like charity, even if you have a sort of ethical idea of what's right and wrong, applying it to a particular situation requires you to decide what is more charitable or not, what is right or not. And so even when you do have ethical principles, it's still up to you to figure out what to do with them. So you're always alone when it comes to making a decision. Even having an ethical framework to work in does not tell you exactly what to do. So you as an individual really cannot escape your freedom. And when you realize that, it makes you feel very alone in choosing what the right thing to do is. Sartre says that even the people we go to for advice already shows the decision that you've made. So if the student goes to ask advice from a priest, the type of priest he asks advice from already shows the decision he's made. If he asks a priest that is collaborating with the Nazi occupation of France, the priest will tell him to stay home and care for his mother. And so his decision has already been made by going to that priest for advice. If he chooses a priest who is part of the resistance, well, then he'll get a very different type of answer. So even if we think that we can rely upon others to help us make decisions, we're still ultimately making the decision ourselves. Sartre says, forlorness implies that we ourselves choose our being. Despair follows from forlornness and anguish because we cannot escape our responsibility and because we are alone in the decisions we make that create who we are. We really cannot blame anything else. And we have to, as Sartre says, confine ourselves to reckoning only with what depends upon our will, on the ensemble of possibilities which make our action possible. He also quotes Descartes, who says, "Conquer yourself rather than the world." Because you are defined by your actions, Sartre says there is no reality except in action. You have to define yourself in terms of what you have done and who you are. And he says this is horrifying to people because people like to make excuses. They don't want to take responsibility for their life. They want to think that who they are is something much greater than their actions or their current way of living. People want to define themselves in terms of miscarried hopes or vain expectations, which Sartre says is a way of defining yourself negatively and not positively, defining yourself in terms of the possibilities that never really came to fruition instead of the things that you actually can control in your life. Sartre says that the only way people can bear their wretchedness is to think, circumstances have been against me. What I've been and done doesn't show my true worth. To be sure, I've had no great love, no great friendship, but that's because I haven't met a man or woman who was worthy. The books I've written haven't been very good because I haven't had the proper leisure. I haven't had children to devote myself to because I didn't find a man with whom I could spend my life. So there remains within me unused and quite viable a host of propensities, inclinations, possibilities that one wouldn't guess from the mere series of things I've done. So Sartre thinks that people define themselves negatively. They want to define themselves in terms of all these possibilities that never really happened. They want to make excuses for who they are instead of taking responsibility for their life. But for Sartre, this is pessimism. And he thinks that we need to be optimistically tough. Sartre explains that when the existentialist writes about a coward, he says that this coward is responsible for his cowardice. He's not like that because he has a cowardly heart or lung or brain. He's not like that on account of his physiological makeup, but he's like that because he has made himself a coward by his acts. There's no such thing as a cowardly constitution. Sartre says that, yes, there might be certain circumstances that make one inclined towards cowardice, right? There might be certain poor constitutions. There might be particular circumstances that make someone more cowardly and less brave. But he thinks that People really want to believe that you're born a coward or you're born a hero, and that you don't make yourself a coward or make yourself a hero. He says that if you're born cowardly, you may set your mind perfectly at rest. There's nothing you can do about it. You'll be cowardly all your life, whatever you may do. If you're born a hero, you may set your mind just as much at rest. You'll be a hero all your life. You'll drink like a hero and eat like a hero. What the existentialist says is that the coward makes himself cowardly and the hero makes himself heroic. There's always a possibility for the coward not to be cowardly anymore, and for the hero to stop being heroic. This is the optimism, the tough optimism that Sartre refers to in existentialism, is that even if circumstances are against you, even if there's immense pressure to act or be a certain way, you as an individual always have the choice to respond to that, to either go with it, to go with your habit, to go with the social pressure, or to resist it and to do something differently. When it comes down to it, it's ultimately your choice what you do and what you make of yourself.